So there is a tremendous context within which human resource management has to operate, and often it's related to changing dynamics in the workplace and in society at large, whether it's governmental issues or whether it's local issues or whether it's laws or the economy, but we have to take all of these things into account. So let's start at the top with respect to demographics, and that's the changing nature of people who could potentially be in our labor market. So one of the most important things is an aging workforce. We have a lot of people who are not retiring as early as their parents did and their grandparents did before them because financially they feel like they can't do that, or they feel driven to continue to work even when they don't have to anymore. Baby boomers are known for being very driven at work, and so those are the people who are in positions to transition to retirement as need be. So an aging workforce means that you have a lot of high-paid employees who have lots of work experience, but what it's also doing is not creating an opportunity for individuals to enter the organization because people at the top are not leaving. That's basically how internal labor markets work, right? We hire people, they work their way up the ladder, and then they retire or they leave the organization, and we continue to funnel people in, obviously at different levels of expertise, but often at the entry level, and people then stay with the company over time. So in the labor market in general, if people aren't retiring, it doesn't create the same opportunities for jobs for people coming in at the entry level. So this notion of, well, just go out and find a job. Well, guess what? There has to be jobs available in order for people to do it. And what also frustrates me in terms of dynamics, and perhaps we'll get to this in some of the bit of information coming up ahead of us, but when we are in a situation where we want to hire people, often they say, well, you need to have years of experience. Well, people can't get years of experience without being hired as an entry-level employee. So it's a catch-22. They say that's something that they want, and at the same time, they don't create the opportunity for people to actually get work experience. So I'm with you. I feel you. I know all those challenges that you're all facing, and these are things that we do need to discuss more and more in the workplace and try to get our employers to recognize how important it is to create opportunities, entry-level opportunities for people. Now, the second item is diversity. And I understand, right, we have a president at the current moment who has made the concept of diversity a bad word. And I want to explain here, and I will get more into that as we get into the next module on employee relations, that diversity is not a bad thing. And we're not talking just demographic diversity, because that's important. And I mean demographic diversity like white, Black, Latino, Asian, et cetera, et cetera. When we're talking about diversity, it's all the ways that people differ. And people differ in so many different ways simply because they have different experiences, they have different upbringings, they live in different parts of the country, they went to different schools, they have different friends. We are all different, and we all bring something unique to the workplace. So we do have changing demographics in that we do have the Latino population as one of the fastest growing populations in the country. That may be changed as dynamics move forward in the United States right now. There's a lot of changes going on in Washington, D.C., which I'm not going to get into at this point. We will talk more about that later. But we no longer can look at it and say this is an environment that's all white males. We have females, we have different ethnic groups, we have different levels of experience, we have different people. What is important is to recognize that under no circumstances has homogeneity been a good thing for organizations that need to compete, or organisms that need to compete? And think about genetics. When we think about genetics, if you take your basic biology, you know that diversity in our gene pool makes a difference. It strengthens the gene pool. It makes sure that that gene pool can be robust, that it can adapt to different things in the environment. And anytime we have homogeneity in our gene pool, we start to have breakdowns in terms of dynamics of errors, flaws, breakdown in the gene pool. People start to have more disabilities, more likely to see genetic anomalies, all these sorts of things. So that's, just from a biology perspective. But let's take it the next step and go to organizations that were homogeneous. Now, let me take you back in history, probably about 40, 50 years. When I first got into the workplace in the 1980s, there were a lot of big corporations that were struggling. This is companies like AT&T and IBM, and I know everybody's heard of AT&T, but IBM has been a little bit more quiet of late, but they still exist for good reasons. And both of those companies had a policy where they would hire people at the entry level, and people would stay with the company until they retired. So they started to have a culture that was very homogeneous. Everybody started to act alike, think alike. Once you came in at the entry level and you were taught how to behave, that didn't change as people moved up in the hierarchy in the organization and eventually, moved up to higher level positions. And so we had a situation where these organizations became very homogeneous. Everybody looked alike, talked alike, behaved alike, made the same kinds of decisions. Nobody challenged each other. And then when they had to compete in a marketplace that was adaptable and needed to have a different way of thinking about things, these companies were failing. And they were very close to disintegrating. And so what they learned was homogeneity in the organization where everybody is alike also creates a weakness in the organization's ability to compete. And once they recognized that cradle to grave workplace loyalty was not going to be a successful way to have a competitive business, they started to change the way they think about things. So IBM never used to lay off people. Neither did AT&T, and they made decisions that they were going to have to start laying people off who were dead weight, who were not contributing to the organization, or divisions and departments that were not being successful, because you can't be successful if you have dead weight, like an anchor hanging around your neck, right? So they started hiring people at all levels from all different perspectives and all different points of view. And lo and behold, those companies became much more competitive, much more successful, and they still exist today. Whereas if they had not changed their ways, they would have disappeared in the late 80s and early 90s. So it is important for you to recognize that diversity of ideas, diversity of perspective, diversity of experiences, whether that's a proxy through people's race and ethnicities, or whether it's simply an example of different ways that people grew up, it doesn't matter. Diversity is important and diversity matters. The pandemic in 2020 into 2021 really changed the nature of work as well. People were more likely to be remote workers, and while many of those companies are bringing workers back into the office, there are still many companies that have decided that remote work has been a really good thing for them, and people feel like they are more productive. Here's what the downside is with remote work. You lose the casual conversations that tend to happen in the hallway or in the cafeteria or as we wander by each other's offices. And sometimes there is a dynamic that happens that is collaborative and creative when we are able to do that. So companies that may require or allow remote work may have to consider ways to build synergies and build collaboration and build a communal dynamic amongst the people, despite the fact that they may be separated geographically, because remote work can really help people to be more productive. But at the same time, you lose some dynamics, so we've got to pay attention to that. Now, during the pandemic, our frontline workers, the ones who were essential workers or people who were customer focused and customer present, really experienced a lot of difficulties. They were put a lot of pressure on them. There was a lot of problems with being treated inhumanely, putting themselves at risk to make a dollar, and not compensating people appropriately. Alternatively, think about this, right? This led to disengagement, which they call the Great Resignation, but ultimately is about disengagement. People stopped being engaged. People stopped caring. And given the amount of stressors that were there for people, if I had the choice to make a little bit less money by going on unemployment or staying on unemployment versus working a job just to say I have a job but be treated poorly, I would pick less money, tighten my belt, and not work for a while. I think we can all understand that. I mean, I understand the challenges that business organizations had, right? They wanted to keep people in there. But you will lose people, as we talked about from that ASA framework, right? The attraction, selection, and attrition framework. You will lose people when you don't treat them with the proper respect and provide them with proper compensation and proper working conditions. And during the pandemic, this put a big, huge microscope on the challenges that many employees were already having and that just got worse under the pandemic. So I'm hoping that organizations learned from that lesson and started to see some changes in the way that they would manage things with their employees. So the remote work is a big one, but I think overall having a good balance of allowing some days where people can work remotely and some days where people can work at home, at work, can make a really big difference for people in terms of morale and engagement and things like that. Another important trend is globalization. And I think what we're going to see probably in the next year or so as our current president increases tariffs is it's going to change the dynamics in the way that organizations do business. Prices will go up. That is the nature of tariffs. And it's not the countries that are exporting the information to us or the products to us that are going to pay those tariffs. Those are tariffs that get added on after the product hits our soil, and the people who are buying it have to pay that, and that gets sent as a tax to the government. And then we have to pass on those costs to the consumers. So in the past, we had a global economy with decreased tariffs that allowed for organizations to go to a country where they could have things done more efficiently and more cost effectively. And now it's going to change the dynamics of that. So it is absolutely going to change the way we think about doing international business. Some people will still have to. So we may not have a choice. There may be products that are only available in other countries. We don't have the infrastructure perhaps in our country for some of these items. And so given that, that creates a dynamic that really has a huge impact on the internationalization and the interconnectedness of the businesses here on the planet. Isolationism has never been a good thing for the United States. It's always created problems for us. So it'll be interesting to see how the next few years play out, given that. Other issues to consider is obviously when we do business in other countries, we have to be aware of the laws and the culture in those countries, and recognizing that the culture in one country is not going to be the same as the culture in our country, and the way they do things in one country, what is legal or illegal, is also not how things will be done here. And so we have to learn those challenges, and I think many of you learned that in your Management 330 class, the principles of management, where you had to investigate the differences in setting up a business in a different culture and what that took to be able to understand and to do that. And so that's the nature of, when we want to expand our business and to sell things in foreign countries, we have to understand their culture and the way that they do business. We can't necessarily assume that everybody's going to want to do things the way we do things. There are, of course, going to be tons more regulations and different regulations now, given changes in our economic policies. But also, when we deal with different cultures, we're dealing with a lot more diverse human beings with different experiences and different frames of reference with respect to how they like to do business and what's important to them. And so we need to be aware of the way that these countries do business. If we want to sell to them, we have to understand their dynamics, how they work, why they do the things that they do, and move on from there.